Hello and welcome to the Warehouse Podcast, part of the Believe Podcast Network. My name is Tyler, and on today's episode, we're going to focus on something I wrote about in Camden Chat this week, which is basically a trade deadline preview of sorts. I know we've got about a month left until we get there. The Orioles have a lot of games in between now and then, and they need to win a lot of them for this to even really be an interesting conversation. But that's kind of why it feels like an important time to do it. We know, the Orioles are rolling a little bit here. They've had some, bad injury luck. They've mostly gotten past, other than this week, Adley goes on the IL. Westberg's dealing with a finger. There's still some things lingering there. But in general, the Orioles are in the best position they've been all year. And that's why I think this is an interesting time to kind of talk about where the Orioles sit right now and kind of the three paths they can take at the trade deadline, as well as some of the factors I think that Mike Elias has to take into consideration when it comes to the trade deadline, because it's not so simple. This is a very complicated time for the Baltimore Orioles, given Brandon Hyde's been fired. You've got an interim manager. The team is supposed to be good, but they're not quite as good as they should be. The farm system is okay. It could be better. Like, there's a lot of factors right now I think that the Orioles need to consider, and Mike Elias in particular needs to consider, even outside of just like the facts of the players in the organization that matter when it comes to the trade deadline next month. So we'll get into all of that on this episode. First, just a reminder for you all. We're part of the Believe Podcast Network. Head over to believe.com, BLEAV.com. Check us out, as well as other shows. There are other Orioles shows on there. The Verge podcast is over there. They do a great job looking at the minor leagues, so check them out, as well as other shows that maybe are non-Orioles. So go over to believe.com and check them out. And also, if you like what you're hearing, there is a video version of this podcast over on YouTube. Go to youtube.com/ at the warehouse pod. That's where we're at. We've got 302 subscribers. We have a link to it in the description of this podcast. So if you can't remember that, youtube.com/ at the warehouse pod. Go down to the podcast notes and we are there as well. And also, to get involved on social, we're on Blue Sky, pretty much, only on Blue Sky at this point. It just is a more healthy environment right now for talking about anything. So go over to Blue Sky. We're at the Warehouse Pod there as well. And again, we'll have a link to that in the notes. But back to the meat of this episode. Oh yeah, before also, just one last note. You may hear my air conditioner in the background. I live in an old house. We have window units. You might hear an air conditioner. I apologize about that. It's 100 degrees today in the Baltimore area. It's been 100 degrees in the Baltimore area for a couple days now. I thought about turning it off for this podcast, but I also thought I might pass out and the podcast could just be hours long of me on top of the microphone. And that's not really good content either. So I made the decision, let's leave it on. It might be some buzzing in the background, but I can't say that our podcast is known for pristine audio quality as it is. So we'll deal with it. If it's too much, let me know. And for future episodes, I will try to address it. But back to the meat of the episode, which is, as I said, next month's trade deadline and what the Orioles can do. So let's, as we always do, lay the groundwork a little bit for where the Orioles are right now. I wrote this on Monday for Camden Chat, so it doesn't take into consideration Monday's game where Trevor Rogers was really, really good. That I think is worth an episode that I think Eli's going to cover the rotation here in the next couple of days or next week or so. So we won't talk about that. So if any of these numbers I say aren't, don't include Monday's game, just understand that I wrote it prior to that game happening. But essentially where the Orioles are at right now, they've got a month left, 5 weeks until the trade deadline. At the time, 31 games left to prove that they are a playoff contender. Where things are at now, they really need to win 2 out of 3 games essentially to end up at 500 by the deadline. I would say the Orioles don't need to get to 500 by the deadline to say that they are buying or selling, but that feels like sort of a reasonable benchmark to get to say, like, this team is legit. They've bounced back from a really bad April and, the first half of May in particular, pretty bad, to be a good team in June. And then at that point through the first half of July, or even all of July, I guess, rather. And you get to that deadline a game or so within 500, feels like a reasonable benchmark to reach before you decide that you are going to go for it at the deadline. Because I think, those are the three, that's the path right there, right? You can buy at the deadline, you can sell at the deadline, or you can do nothing at the deadline. You can sort of buy and sell, you can kind of sit on your hands, you can sort of not go for it entirely in 2025, but not sell off for 2026. That's something that I think, like, the Yankees are a team that does that a lot of times, is especially when they're, good, not great. The Yankees have been pretty good the last couple of years, but you don't really see the Yankees sell at the deadline. The Yankees a lot of times kind of just hold on to what they got, see how things shake out in August and September, and don't sell the farm too much. I think the Orioles could potentially approach it that way as well. But before we get into that, I do want to talk about some precedent for what the Orioles are in right now. If we look back at 2022, the Orioles were similarly 10 games under 500 in mid-June. We're a little bit later in the season at this point, but 10 games under 500 in June. They got hot. They got to the deadline at 52 and 51. Remember, this was the season where the Orioles had kind of come out of the fog of being in the rebuild, fully in the throes of the rebuild from, 2019 through 2021. Obviously had that interesting 2020 season with COVID, and the Orioles were actually pretty competitive there, in the 60 game season. But in general, they were rebuilding for 3 seasons there. Got to 52 and 51. I think there was a lot of talk at that time about could they go for it? Like you don't always get a winning season. Like let's just sell, let's buy and let's see what happens. And there's a lot of talent and there was young guys, Gunnar coming up. Adley was young. Let's see what happens there. Ultimately, Mike Elias decided to sell at the deadline. He traded away Trey Mancini and Jorge Lopez, who was the closer, made the All-Star game that year. And the team ended up basically being a 500 team the rest of the way. They finished the season at 83 and 79, 3 games out of the final wild card spot. That I think, looking back, you could have said, hey, you make a trade here or there, you can win 3 more games and get into the playoffs. But I think ultimately the decision was, sure, this team could make the playoffs, but are they good enough to really make any noise in the playoffs, win a series in the playoffs? Elias made the decision that that wasn't going to happen. And I think a lot of us, even at the time, understood that we weren't rebuilding for 3 years just to sell guys to squeak into the playoffs with 86 wins with a at the time was a pretty terrible pitching staff and get bounced in the first round and then not be as far ahead going into 2023 as we would have. Maybe they wouldn't have won 101 games in 2023, won the AL East. A lot of things could have changed if they decide to go for it in 2022 instead of being a little bit more pragmatic and kind of taking a step back and saying being honest with themselves with where they're at. Now in 2025, I think the situation is slightly different because, first of all, in 2022, they weren't supposed to be good. They were supposed to be probably a little bit better than 2021, maybe win 70 games. They ended up being a lot better than that, a much more interesting watch. Whereas in 2025, I think, you come into it, even without Corbin Burns, I think you look at the Orioles as, deep playoff contenders. They would say they have World Series aspirations, didn't make a ton of great moves in the offseason to kind of push them that way. But I think you would have viewed the Orioles coming into the year as, an 85-ish win team, get to the deadline at 500 or so, make some moves, and you could kind of propel yourselves forward into being a 90 win team, maybe compete for the division crown at that point, and certainly you're in the game in the playoffs by a couple of games there. Things have changed a little bit now because the team has played so poorly the first month and a half of the season. They've dug themselves such a hole that they now have to play really, really well. They have to win 2/3 of their games from here through the deadline, and then from there they need to play 600 ball, 550 ball to really get into the playoffs. That's a tall order, but they've got the talent. We've seen for the last month that they can win 2/3 of their games. We know they've got more guys coming back. We know Adley's going to be back. We know Kyle Bradish is going to be back. We know Tyler Wells will be back. We think Grayson Rodriguez will be back. You add all those guys to a team that, if they get to the deadline at 500, has played great baseball for 2 months at that point. I think you start to feel pretty good about that. Do you ignore the first month and a half and say that the real team is the last 2 months and we should double down on that? Or do you say, no, there's too many flaws in this team that, yes, they've played well recently, but the pitching staff is lacking X, Y, or Z. Yes, the offense is doing better, but it's still overly reliant on the home run ball. And, we don't have like that clear star, player right now because yes, Gunnar has played well, but not near the MVP level. And I think if it's not Gunnar, you don't really have that level of player right now. Jackson Holliday is playing well, but not up to that level. Colton Cowser, Jordan Westbrook, they've come back from the IL and looked really good. But again, they're not quite an MVP type of player. Is Ryan O'Hearn still hitting as well as he did in the first month? I don't know. All these things you have to consider to, kind of, it's what you choose to believe. Are you looking at the first month and a half? Or are you looking at the last 2 months? What's the real team? Do we believe in them? And kind of make a decision from there. So, let's talk about what are some of the considerations, because I think we just kind of laid out where the team is at, what the precedent is, does it make sense? Doesn't make sense? We'll talk more about that in a minute, but I think let's talk about some of the considerations here that Mike Elias has to think about with relation to the trade deadline. And I think first is ownership. this is the second season that David Rubenstein and his group have owned the majority of the Orioles. 75 years old, David Rubenstein. He said at the end of 2024, he was talking, I think, on a radio program about his age and how that relates to wanting to win and, bring his hometown a World Series championship. And he was pretty, transparent about it and said, look, I know I don't have as long to do this as some guys in their 50s, basically. Like, I don't have 30 years. I've got maybe 10 to do this. And he said, quote, he might want to, quote, speed up the effort to get to a World Series a lot sooner than maybe some younger owners would. And obviously that's relevant for Mike Elias because Mike Elias has not gone deep into the playoffs yet. Yes, they've gone to the playoffs 2 straight years. They've had winning records 3 straight years. Yet to win a playoff series, yet to win a playoff game. And I think you start to, if you're David Rubenstein, say, okay, Mike, you've clearly figured out how to rebuild an organization. You've done a good job. You've gotten this team to being competent year to year. I think obviously the first month and a half this year sucks, but the last month has been really intriguing. And as I've said before, they might get back to being competent by year's end. You've figured that out. The farm system is pumping out some intriguing names, but you seem to lack an ability to get us over that final hump. You seem to lack an ability, that killer instinct of, let's go get these one or two guys. Let's maybe overpay a little bit here because that guy is going to have exactly what we need to push this team from an 80, 85 win team to a 90 win, 95 win team and get us farther in the playoffs. You haven't quite seemed to have the ability to do that. Yes, last year you got Corbin Burns, then your offense, that is like the crown jewel of how you build a baseball team, fell apart. So there are some things there that if you're David Rubenstein, I think is reasonable to say, can you really do this? Can you do what I'm looking for you to do? And yes, I said I've got 10 years, but right now I've got Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, Jackson Holiday, Kobe Mayo, if he turns it around, Colton Cow. I got a lot of really talented young guys all at the same time. I might not have this again in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. So I need to do it. I need to take advantage of it right now. And I think that's only heightened by the fact that Brandon Hyde's already been fired. It's not super common, I don't think, that the GM gets to rehire another manager and have too many cracks at it. Typically when your manager falls apart, usually your team falls apart and then the GM's the next one out the door. Now this could be the reverse. Maybe Hyde was part of the problem. I think injuries were a bigger part of the problem. And the team turns it around, and then Elias looks like a genius for making that change midseason. But you can see how one thing leads to the other, and Elias's job is now on the line because of Brandon Hyde. And for all of that to say, if Elias feels like his job is on the line and his job is directly tied to how the Orioles do in 2025, maybe he's more aggressive at the deadline. Maybe he kind of looks at these things and say, hey, we're only 3 games under 500 at the deadline. Let's go for it. This team has played really good baseball for 2 months. That's who they are. And hey, let's look at the AL, because this is another consideration, is the American League isn't super talented this year. We've talked about this before. It's kind of the Tigers and the Yankees and not a lot else. A lot of teams around 500 have dipped below 500, come back up. A lot of teams right around that, where if the Orioles can get to the trade deadline in range of 500, it's not ridiculous to think that they could continue to play really well for August and September and squeak into the playoffs. And then you're talking about momentum there. So I think those two things together are really worth noting, that the AL's not super talented, so the Orioles could be worse this year and still get into the playoffs. And two, if Elias thinks he's going to get fired this offseason because he doesn't make the playoffs, that could change him a little bit. That could turn him away from being a pragmatist into a survivalist and doing whatever it takes to survive. And you can understand that. It might not be the best for the future of the Baltimore Orioles necessarily, but it would be the best for Mike Elias personally, and potentially, make the Orioles in 2025 the best version that they could be at this point. Now, on the flip side, the Orioles have a lot of names that I think would be intriguing at the deadline. Just a quick list is in the rotation. You've got Zach Eflin, Charlie Morton, and Tomoyuki Sagano, all guys on expiring contracts, all older guys that I think any team would probably take at the back of their rotation. Morton's numbers are still pretty ugly, but he's been really, really good for about a month now. Eflin has had some injury stuff this year, but I think ultimately the league understands who Zach Eflin is. Was really good for the Orioles last year, really good to start the year. Had his injury stuff, has not been quite as good since, but there's still a month left for him to get right. So I think the league understands what he is. and he'd be valuable as a 4 or 5 on a lot of good teams. Sagano has started to wobble a little bit, but in general been really impressive. And again, sort of a similar thing as Morton and Eflin, I think to a lesser degree because he's less of a known quantity. But again, if you're looking for innings, decent innings, quality innings at a 4.5 ERA type, even though Sagano's been better than that for the year at large, I think Sagano's not a bad option there. Then in the bullpen, you got Sir Anthony Dominguez and Gregory Soto, two hard throwers left and right. Again, middle relief pitching goes no problem at the deadline. You're not going to get a ton back for them, but easy to trade and get some, mid-level prospects for. Ramon Laureano, Cedric Mullins, I think outfield depth is valuable. Mullins as a pinch runner and a defensive sub on any team. Laureano as a right-handed bat to face some lefties off the bench. And again, his defensive metrics aren't great, but he's got a really good arm. So I think still probably an upgrade over some like slugger types that maybe play left or right field throughout the league. And then Ryan O'Hearn, although he's dipped a little bit in June, has been a really, really good hitter this year and has been really good, for the last couple of years with the Orioles. And a lot of people talked about him as the best rental bat on the market. Rental bat just being a guy that is on an expiring contract, probably isn't going to cost a ton, but is easier to get from a team than a guy with multiple years of control because every team thinks they're going to compete next year. So they hang on to those guys with control. Whereas O'Hearn, if the Orioles decide they're out, then it makes no sense to hold on to O'Hearn. Now, the only counter to that is qualifying offer discussions. If the Orioles think that they are going to give somebody a qualifying offer that they are likely to decline, and then the Orioles could get a draft pick as compensation if and when that player signs elsewhere for a certain dollar amount, then maybe they hold on to them. I think maybe the pitchers fall into that. Again, the qualifying offer does change every year. It's above $20 million for a single season right now. So I think some of the pitchers could be getting that. Eflin, Morton, maybe Sagano. 1 year, $22 million doesn't seem crazy for them. Morton, he's toyed with retiring recently, so maybe that doesn't happen. But I think the Orioles might be okay with that for like a guaranteed number 4 in the rotation. So you have to weigh that. You have to say, all right, I could get a draft pick maybe for these guys instead of these two prospects that I'm getting offered. So that's something to consider there. O'Hearn doesn't feel like a qualifying offer guy. I mean, $22 million for a guy that's really a DH. Played better defense at first this year, but still, I'm kind of squishy on that. I've seen some people say Mullins is definitely getting a qualifying offer. I disagree with that, quite frankly. I love Cedric. Been great for the Orioles. But his skills are diminishing. He's not quite as fast as he once was. His arm has never been good. He's not getting to quite as many balls in the gap as he has in the field, and not showing as much power as he has. Still a really valuable player. I just don't think qualifying offer level. So, maybe that's a consideration for him. Otherwise, though, I think you're looking at what you get from him versus what value he is to you the rest of the season. Because look, the Orioles have to field a team for the rest of the season, even if they decide to sell. You're not going to sell every single person because you need to field a competent team. You don't want to thrust minor leaguers into the major league situation before you want to do that. So there is that consideration as well. You shouldn't just trade everybody because there is value in letting a good prospect marinate a little bit in AAA versus getting a 20-year-old that you have, some hopes for 2 months of a veteran. You got to balance those things as well. So that could be why like Mullins goes, but Laureano stays because they just don't get a ton of offers for him. Something like that. But those are kind of the things to think about when you're talking about, plenty to sell. And then I think the final thing, I've kind of talked about why the Orioles might be aggressive. Again, they have been much better for the last month. So there's reason to believe they're on the upswing. Plus, there could be pressure from ownership on the front office to buy. Reason to sell is, you're out of it, of course, and it makes no sense to kind of double down on a mistake. But on top of that, you've got some intriguing pieces to sell. Again, none of these guys I think are going to net you a top 100 prospect necessarily, but I think the Orioles could replenish sort of that mid-tier type of prospect, the high A, double A guys with some interesting ceilings on them. I think they could get some of those guys for their various pieces, and that could make a lot of sense for the Orioles. The farm system, I think, especially at the bottom, has not been super impressive this year. Again, there's a lot of time to develop there, but if you look at some of the offensive games that Delmarva and Aberdeen put together, it's pretty brutal a lot of nights. So I think the Orioles could use some help in that tier of their minor league system. But then, of course, the third route is to just sort of hold on to what you've got. Um, and that's to say that, you think the team you've built is already pretty good. You don't want to overcommit one way or the other. You don't want to sell everything off because you could still get there, but you don't want to buy either because this team isn't really worth investing a whole lot in. And I think a team you kind of look at as a comp there is the Detroit Tigers last year in 2024. They got to the end of July, 5 games under 500, and their front office even thought about trading Tarek Skubal, who ended up winning the Cy Young last year, but they ended up holding on to him. They dealt away Jack Flaherty and Mark Canha, as well as Andrew Chafin last year. So a starter, an outfielder, and a bullpen piece. I could see the Orioles doing that. You trade uh, Sagano, you trade Laureano, you trade Soto, but you kind of keep the rest of the pieces together. You assume like the health is going to get better, and you kind of ride with what you got. The Tigers last year, they started winning in August. They went 34-19 from the start of August through the end of the season. They got the final wild card spot. They won in the wild card round, and they actually pushed the Guardians to 5 games in the ALDS. I don't think that's totally out of the realm of possibility for the Orioles to do that. Again, there's upside on the roster. They've played a lot better for the last month, and there are guys coming. We know Bradish, Rodriguez, Wells. Well, we assume Rodriguez is coming back. This team is trending up, and there's reason to believe you don't have to do a whole lot, and you could end up looking pretty smart there. You could make sure that your farm system doesn't really get poached at all. You could make some small ancillary moves to, get a couple lottery ticket types into the farm system that can help. And then you're probably promoting a guy like Basayo or Beavers late in the season, maybe to help out your team, and that could be interesting as well. So there's enough there that I think the Orioles could logically say we're not going to be super active at the deadline because we kind of believe in what we got, and there's no reason to overreact this time of year. But I think that probably comes with the caveat of ownership in the front office need to be in lockstep on that a little bbit. I think ownership needs to understand, hey, Elias, you're coming back next year. We believe in you. The team has been so much better these last 2 months. We just need to get healthy. Maybe Mancelino's coming back. I don't know. That's a whole different discussion. But hey, Mike, your process was logical. Ultimately, we determined your process is logical. We just got a little bit unlucky. Let's not sell the farm. Let's hang tight. And, we're going to give you budget to replenish some of these spots next year. Let's maybe be a little bit more aggressive on the pitching side of things. Let's hand out a QO to Zach Eflin to make sure we got a number 4 next year. And let's kind of ride with what we got. I think that's very possible as well. So I think that's kind of what I want to talk about in this episode was sort of the 3 paths they can take and some of the factors contributing to the Orioles' decisions at the deadline next month. So let me know what you guys think about that in the comments of this video, in the comments of this podcast. I know you can leave comments on Spotify. And again, you can go over to Blue Sky and tweet at us, the Warehouse Pod. I'll try to make sure we put a post up about this episode coming out, and then you can use that as a place to respond to your thoughts on this topic. I think it's a really interesting spot the Orioles are in. Obviously, recording this at the end of the June. There's still a month left. There's a lot that can happen. Injuries, games, the All-Star break, a lot of things in between now and then that can change the trajectory here a little bit. But I think that's why it's important to have that now because Mike Elias is having those conversations, at least peripheral conversations with other GMs right now to say, like, hey, if we're in it, what would you give up? What would you want for this guy? Or if we're not in it, what would you go up for that guy? I think those conversations are already happening, and it'll just be interesting to see, how things pivot in the next, 4 or 5 weeks. And, of course, once that happens, we'll have a podcast as well to recap the Orioles, action, inaction, whatever it is. So if you're not subscribed to us, please do so on your favorite podcast app or over on YouTube at the Warehouse Pod. We'd really, really appreciate it, as well as a like on each of the videos and a comment. It goes a long way to getting us into other people's feeds to make sure that we can kind of keep growing and keep the podcast going beyond the 2025 season. So that's all I've got for this episode. Again, thanks so much for listening. Subscribe to us, follow us all over the place, and head to Believe.com to check out our show as well as others because they've been, a big help in getting us out there these last 2 seasons, and we've really appreciated it. But as I said, my name is Tyler. This has been the Warehouse Podcast, and thank you for listening. See ya.